These are going to be the skeleton, the muscles, the fat, and the skin. And out of these building blocks, we can create really any character we want. You can almost think about this as a slider in a game where you have a character creator, where you have first the length of the bones. That's going to determine the main proportions of the character. Imagine if the femur here, the thigh bone, was twice the length. The character would now be a lot taller. What if the spine was half the length? The character would be a lot shorter. What if the muscles were absolutely tiny? It would look like a pretty scrawny character. What if they were giant? Well, it would look more like a hulking figure. What if the fat pads were absolutely massive? It would look like an overweight character. And what if they were barely in a fat pad to speak of? It would look like a very skinny character. And what if the skin is very elastic? It would look like a very young character. And what if it's not elastic and it's saggy? It would look like a very old character. Combining these four elements into one, you can really create any character you need. But the important part is that you need to build them step by step. You can't just move into any one of them arbitrarily. You have to start off with the skeleton. Then you have to create the muscles. Then you have to create the fat pads. And then you have to create the skin. And this is going to be the recipe that we're going to be using for really the whole course going forward, particularly when we are creating a character at the end as well. I really can't stress how important this series of steps is. Starting off from the skeleton, getting that right first. Then we get the muscles, and then we get the fat, and then finally we get the skin. The skeleton is really the foundation of our entire character. Like mentioned just before, it really determines the main proportions. The length and size of the bones is going really to determine what the character looks like. If we were to reduce everything else, take away everything else, you're still left with a pretty human looking figure when it comes to our skeleton. If you were to take away the skeleton, for instance, and you only had muscle, it would just be like some goo lying on the ground. Same with the fat, just some goo. Same with the skin, just like a little gooey thing on the ground. But this looks like a person. Looks like a pretty weird person, but still looks fundamentally like a person. If you don't know anything else about anatomy, but you know the skeleton, you can still create a pretty convincing figure. If you just were to take the main proportions we have here and just kind of fill them in, just kind of add some tubes around, basically just going over the whole thing without really knowing anything about anatomy in this case, in terms of the muscles and fat and the skin, just kind of just working over what we're seeing here, you'll be left with a pretty human looking figure. And that would be a pretty good starting point, to be perfectly honest. So the bones are really, really important. We are, of course, going to go more in depth into the bones in later chapters. So the bones, the foundation for everything. You're going to keep hearing me say the sentence, get the bones right and everything else will follow, throughout the whole course. And the more you learn about anatomy, the more true that becomes. If you want to learn advanced anatomy, for instance, one of the things they're going to be talking about is going to be the bones. A lot of beginners, they focus very much on the muscles, the specific shapes and the origin and insertion, all that of the muscles. But the more you learn about anatomy, the more it boils down to getting the bones right. The bones are also very much the foundation of the balance of the character and in terms of the pose. If you're doing any kind of animation, you really need to understand the skeleton. That said, of course the muscles are important. The muscles are also incredibly important. When you have the skeleton, you basically have the structure for the character. But the muscles are the elements that allow you to actually move. Now, this looks incredibly complicated, but don't worry about that. We are going to break this down into simple volumes that we can actually understand. There are an untold amount of muscles in the human body, and in order to actually learn how to use anatomy as a tool, we have to simplify this down. If you start to memorize every single muscle, it simply will not work. Even in what we're looking at here, there's still things here that is just superfluous stuff you don't really need day to day. So it's really important to simplify down the muscles. As a little teaser for the muscle chapters, muscles can really only do one thing, and that is to contract. So if we were to look at the skeleton again, the way you do muscles here is you simply just go from bone to bone and then muscles contract. Like, now what I'm doing now isn't really correct anatomy in any sense of the word, but you're just basically just making a string going from one bone to another bone, and then that string gets shorter. That's all muscles are in the simplest way. It's just pieces of string that go from bone to bone, and they will get shorter. I find this to be a very useful way of thinking about it, because whenever you're creating a character, in terms of you want the motion to work, it's when you can think about this as almost like you've made a cardboard robot or something like that, and now you need it to move. So we have the main pieces would be of this cardboard robot would be the bones, and now you need to move stuff around. You just take pieces of string from parts of this cardboard robot and you just place them in other places, and from one piece of cardboard to the other one. And if this string gets shorter, you have movement, and that is muscles. Then we have fat. Fat is also an incredibly important part of the whole process. Without fat, your characters will look incredibly unnatural. And we're not even talking about somebody being overweight or underweight. Everyone is going to have fat to some degree, even like a quote unquote normal looking person. They still going to have a lot of fat. And fat is one of the things that softens off the muscles. Fat is on top of the muscles, and the muscles are again on top of the bones. And it's just going to soften off the whole character. Particularly for the face, the fat is incredibly important. I mean, you can't really see it too well here, but it looks very ghoulish. And once you start to add the fat pads onto the face, everything becomes a lot more natural right away. And then finally, we have skin. Skin is the final layer of our little formula, and essentially just wraps around the whole character. The way I like to think about skin is that skin either goes from being very elastic here to not elastic here. So if it's at this area here and you were to like take your finger here and like pinch it and then just like drag it around, it would just go straight back to where it was. But if it's inelastic over here and you were to do the same thing, you were to like pinch it here and then you like drag it out, it would just kind of flap around. Essentially, this whole thing is aging. So the elasticity of the skin is all down to how young you are. So if you are incredibly young, then you're going to have, like, let's say you're like 2 years old, you're going to have no wrinkles to speak of whatsoever. And the skin is just really elastic. And then if you are like 1,000 years old, then you have really, really wrinkled skin. And one of the main reasons here is the elasticity of the skin simply has gone down. So this is one of the sliders you can just drag around just to make the character feel younger or feel older. So skin is incredibly important to get right, and it really is the last part of our equation. And the way you would really think about this is, does it wrinkle or does it not wrinkle? And of course, we are going to go more in depth into skin later on. So these are our 4 building blocks. I highly recommend you simply just memorize this. I mean, it's just 4 items, right? It's not a whole lot to memorize. But when it comes to drawing or sculpting your characters, creating the character in this order is going to transform how it looks. First, you start with skeleton, get the bones right, and everything else will follow. Then you do the muscles. Without the skeleton, you literally can't do the muscles. Then on top of that, we're adding the fat pads. And then on top of that, again, we're wrapping skin over the whole character.